one more presentation left for today at the Arttech seminar here at Assembly. And what would be a better way to spend Friday evening than to listen about horror stories and maybe also some success stories of using or managing GitHub Enterprise. We have Kalle here from Eficode. Please take it away.
Thank you, Sonja. So, hello. I'm Kalle Sirkesalo. I'm from Eficode. I work as our CTO of Managed Services. So my job is to tell about what happens in the technical world and improve on that. I've been doing DevOps things, which probably nobody knows, but hey, it's about breaking down walls. My hobbies are in sailing, and it's my first time talking to our live audience in 2 years, I think. So this is fantastic. So, last talk we had at least 5 mentions of GitHub. I'm not talking about that GitHub. I'm talking about the GitHub that you run on your own servers or in Azure or comparable. So you actually have a version of GitHub that can be run on-premise or comparable location. And there are a multitude of reasons why you might want to do that. And about 10 years ago, one of our customers informed us that they want to run it. And that Eficode, as their managed services provider for their few other things, should help them, mainly SVN at that point. So we had to figure out what's GitHub Enterprise, because nobody had heard of it. And nobody had heard of it 4 years ago still. And 3 years ago, it started to break off. People started to hear that there is actually a GitHub that fills their data regulations, etc., in banking. Also latency, and some authentication problems that they might have in cloud. I do truly recommend running on github.com when possible, and not going with GitHub Enterprise on-premise if you can avoid it. We've been doing this 10 years, and to this date, we are still sometimes very baffled by how it works. We know what's inside it, but it doesn't have any documentation, which we get into. It's an amazing tool, and does bring you GitHub on your own managed environment. So amazing from that perspective. So why would you worry about GitHub or any other CI or Git tool or comparable that manages your version control? Well, the reality is, most of the developers that we work with, especially in game companies, they want to do something completely different than managing their pipelines, thinking about where their code is, thinking about where is the latest art, who is doing what is happening. None of that matters, because they just want to get the product out and see the happy customers. You want to get that feeling that someone else is playing your game and seeing how they're doing that. Or a normal business program. They don't want to worry about all of the other stuff. And what do I mean with all of the other stuff? This is what your software development pipeline looks like. So everything else, except that small box there, where we will get to, is the rest of the software production. So you have a bunch of other stuff that happens behind the scenes or behind the product development. Coding and art creation is a very huge part, but a small part of the whole process. Creating value is done in that one part, which is hidden in the middle of a bunch of other processes to get a product launching. So if you want to, for example, get something into iOS store, you have a bunch of signatures that you have to get, you have a bunch of testing things that you need to go through, and you have to run it and deploy it somewhere. It's not, well, it is super simple if you put all of the automation in place, and it works fantastically. If you don't put any of this automated, well, you can see the amount of boxes. So it becomes a crying thing to get to production. So often, the challenges that we hear and listen and work with, especially in GitHub, but in all of the other cases, and why all of this becomes a problem, is a widespread of different things that everybody keeps thinking that their ideas are very unique. But in reality, most of the time, your unique problem is not actually unique. We've most likely Googled it, or someone else has Googled it. So bunch of different things that might end up hurting you. So then to the actual topic of why GitHub Hurts is amazing also at the same time. So GitHub's deployment is one of the easiest deployments I have ever done. It's a black box AMI. AMI standing for a ready-made box, which you take and deploy. And then you have a GitHub UI ready to go. It works. Now you have a GitHub running. Fantastic. What's it doing? I don't know. What's happening in the background? I don't know. How's it doing the disk space? I don't know. OK, so is it documented somewhere? No. What happens is that it does all of the things that are seen as complicated. So if you want to use iSCSI or cloud-native disk spaces, it automatically puts them into fstop. If you know what it is, then you know Linux. If you don't, it's a Linux way of defining this disk is where you put the data. Sadly, it doesn't tell you any of this. It does it all automatically. So you just have to trust it's doing it, or check it after. If you want to do, for example, there is an MySQL in there is an MS SQL server there is a Redis database there is an Elasticsearch there. So if there is something wrong in any of them, and you want to run any of the diagnostic tools, the official documentation states, ask from GitHub support before running any of the commands. That doesn't really help you when the system is down. So what you end up doing is you practice these commands and figure out what are they doing, what can I do with these, and where do they affect different systems. So we've been writing our own internal documentation on people telling them what are the commands doing and how do you diagnose if something breaks. Lately, one of our guys has been writing a whole monitoring which uses all kinds of black magic. If we're here, if we're in bar, I can tell you about SSH and how it works. It's magic, but it allows us to read and run the commands, parse them, and create our own monitoring based on what's going on inside the system. So if it wasn't hard enough that you don't know what's running there, and you have something running, which allows the developers to work hard, which is fantastic, but now you have a system you don't know how it's running, you start customizing it, of course. Like, what else can you do? We're in game development. We have SVN. If you don't know what SVN is, you're lucky. If you know what it is, you're too old like me. SVN is an old version control system that allowed basically pushing binaries directly. And some companies still have those SVN servers running and working. Well, we want to get rid of the SVN, so we need to migrate most of the people away from SVN. But migrating everybody at one point might be business critically dangerous or hard, or it might just not be feasible at this point of time. So we create an SVN bridge. What does it do? It replicates GitHub to SVN and SVN to GitHub. These are two completely different data structures, so it might break sometimes. That is meaning it breaks most of the time when you start taking it into use. So our documentation with there states that fixing the SVN bridge starts by killing the whole system, rebooting it, and seeing if it started. If it started, everything is OK. If it didn't, start Googling. There is like error messages at that point everywhere. It usually works by just shutting it down and starting, or just working. We've now managed, in most customers, move away from SVN. So nowadays, not a bad problem. But in the beginning, 8 years ago when I started upkeeping GitHub, I can tell you that a few nights I was awake fixing SVN bridges and figuring out what is SVN bridge, because I had no idea what is SVN bridge. Because I had never thought that someone would be stupid enough that they would be synchronizing Git and SVN at the same time. And then I figured, oh, I'm the idiot here. But thankfully, not that big of a problem anymore. Then to the next problem. As said, every time you want to do something with GitHub, you need to boot it. Well, GitHub server does a migration of everything, checks the database migrations on every boot up. And you can't run it on a high available setup so that you would have 2 highly available nodes at the same time. You can only run it in active-passive mode, meaning that if one node goes down, you have to manually promote the other node to tell it, hey, this is now the main node. So it means that every time you boot it up, in large instances, this can take 15 minutes for boot up. So if it's broken and you're trying to debug it, you might spend the next 4 hours rebooting the instance. So you better put the active-passive in place before. There is a clustering for GitHub, which GitHub themselves states to everybody, don't do it. It is even more flaky than running it in active-passive. It's a lot easier to run it in active-passive. If you're not in the performance problem, don't run GitHub clustering. Once again, go to github.com if possible. Their downtime has been like 7 hours this year. You probably don't work on those 7 hours. How do you migrate to GitHub? Well, fantastic, you didn't before. Well, you did, but you lost a lot of history. So nowadays, in the late, let's say, 2 years, 4 years that I've been talking, GitHub was purchased by Microsoft. And, well, Microsoft wants to move everybody to their products, of course. So all of a sudden, you started to get migration tools. GitHub Wallet allows us to migrate, for example, complete Jenkins instances 80% of the time. So 20% you still need to fix manually, but it allows you to move the tool almost automatically to cloud, which is fantastic because in reality, this was years worth of work to migrate from one tool to another in DevOps, because you have all kinds of dependencies and all kinds of things that you need to map. Right now you get a report from GitHub or the GitHub's tooling telling you where are the problems going to be. And you can already tell the customer, these repositories are going to be easy, and this is where we are going to be doing custom work together. Can we get these teams working with us? So when we are planning someone's movement from, let's say, SVN to GitHub, or Bitbucket to GitHub, or GitLab to GitHub, we can actually tell nowadays what are we working on, instead of us telling the customer, yeah, it's going to take a year, and then we know what we fixed. So things are going forward, and I really love the new tooling on migrating things. Another fantastic thing with GitHub is its backups and IAM. GitHub's backup client is a script. It's in the github.com. You go and search for, in github.com/GitHub, you find a backup client script that allows you to run the backups and take them, which is fantastic, amazing thing, except you have to store them in a local disk. So you can't use prop storages, you can't use S3 buckets, you can't use things that you would like to put the backup safely, so that you wouldn't consume a huge amount of cloud bill, for example, or another bill. Or you would need to take a whole ISCSI for 2 times for that GitHub. So that means you end up making a backup script, running it on the local disk, pushing that into the cloud, and then doing that again every night. So you have to customize the script quite a lot to get it into huge and performatic way. And then we get to the IAM, which most of you might not know. IAM stands for Identity and Access Management. It is one of the hardest things that I have found in IT. Not because it's hard, it is hard, but because it complicates everything, because it's tied to everything in IT. So think about it this way. In the good old days, you could log in everywhere with Facebook authentication, and everything worked with single sign-on. Amazing. And then we realized that's a really bad idea, because Facebook collects all of the data from you. So then we broke that system up, and everybody started using different accounts again everywhere. Well, now companies are trying to get everybody to use single account, usually Azure AD, and authenticate everywhere with that one account. But because we didn't actually go all in, even in the consumer side, for the single sign-on, when it was almost close, it wasn't actually, but we were closer than ever before, it became quite a mess. Thankfully, Google authentication has become a bit more of a standard now. The other thing is that the scripting that has been done for the identity and access management, it doesn't understand that if you want to bring the users from OUTUP, so read what are the users' groups and permissions, and you want to authenticate from a single sign-on, that you want to use 2 different systems. It doesn't know how to map those users. So you have to take the script and start tuning it. So for example, Azure AD accounts come in to the system with the authentication so that it removes the @ sign and after that. Meaning, if you synchronize from the OUTUP and bring the users with the email, you now need to parse away the email, end of the email to match the users again in the system, because it thinks it's a different user. In addition, you can only have one authentication type enabled. So you either go all in on SSO, or you go all in on OUTUP authentication. OUTUP authentication, if that's not familiar to you, it's also Active Directory authentication, which is a bit older way of doing authentication. If you have used github.com, you know that the group support isn't really there. There isn't really groups. You have teams. They kind of work within organization, but not really. You need to do quite a lot of figuring out on the structure to make them work properly, but usually it becomes a mess. That's even worse in Github Enterprise Server. You need to plan a lot about how do you want to show repositories and what is the permission models and how do you support those. And then the worst part, which is disabling users automatically. There is nothing for it. There is no APIs for it. There is nothing. We've been looking into it, and it's looking better. And you can do it with hacks and grinds, but there is no official API to disable a user. Not in GraphQL and not in a REST API. They are most likely coming because the API gets more and more fine-tuned with the GraphQL. So, fantastic times, lots of scripting, lots of removed nightmares. Then GitHub comes out and releases their CI/CD. So if you don't know what that is, when we looked at the picture over here, the CI/CD's job is to automate the rest of the pipeline. So continuous integration automates the build process, and continuous deployment, which is the CD, automates the deployment. They're usually used as the same concept because they are the same, like the idea is the same. You want to not just build, you want to also release the pipeline. So, what could happen if you bring such a feature to a well-known version control system? Well, the first thing is, it comes to github.com, and the first thing we got asked is, can we enable Github Actions for our on-premise server? And we are like, there is no such feature yet. Well, could we still enable it? And you're like, no. Then, as the users are users everywhere, so in games and so in business, they start tracking the release notes. And when there is the first mention of open beta for GitHub Actions, the ticket arrives. Can we now enable it? Because I see it has become available. And you're like, it is in open beta. We can ask GitHub, but do you really want to be the first customer for it? Yes. Can we not? And you know, you have promised the customer an uptime, a functioning system, and that it needs to be functioning properly. Yeah, that's going to be fun. So of course I said yes, and we deployed it. Then, now we have actions there, so next question, of course, is how do I actually use these? Because they hadn't looked into what actions are. So now it's time to figure out how do you run actions on-premise, and what does it mean for the end user. OK, now we have running actions, and we get all of the fun stuff of enterprise IT, which also exists in the game industry. Proxies, which are systems that enable network segregations. You can have a network that is not visible anyway other than one IP to one area. How do you run these actions behind such a system? Well, there is a bunch of things you need to do. Kubernetes, wow, fantastic. We have everything in Kubernetes. How do we put these actions there? Well, actually, GitHub released month ago, an official open source documentation of open source tools that can run actions in cloud. They don't themselves yet support that, but hey, we're closer to it, and we've been running these for a year now in Kubernetes, so yeah. Then comes the packages. So you think you release just GitHub Actions to the end users, but there is such a thing as binary management in GitHub called packages, where you could push your binaries, Docker images, comparables, and store the data. Well, of course, the customer will, at the first moment, start using these also. And you're like, oh, so you're asking me about the packages, but didn't we just enable you only with actions? And then you start figuring out why do the GitHub packages not support something like OCI compliant Docker images? I'm not going to explain that. You can Google it. So, fantastic. Now we have GitHub Actions running. How do we actually monitor that customers are using this and that they have enough resources and everything? We don't have an API for these, actually. We don't have any way of tracking what's going on. So we build a custom monitoring once again, because we need the information. We want to see how many jobs pass, how many jobs fail. So we go to GitHub and ask, how do I read from the database all the data so I can track these things? And GitHub answers, computer says no. You don't read from the database. Use the API. So once again, we start custom writing a program to read the APIs, hoping that we can get enough data. This is why we are writing the automation script with the SSH right now. So next, GitHub releases advanced security. It is amazing. Like, CodeQL by GitHub is one of the my most loved projects ever to do on midsummer. This year I studied about the CodeQL and how it works, what it does on my midsummer, because I was bored and it was fantastic. So what it actually does, it takes the compiled packages of your code and gives you all of the good old, hey, now you can search from the code with SQL-like syntax, but you need to know what these things are called in computer science. Not in programming, not in literature, in science. So you need to remember, what did you study in university if you studied? What was the term for methods? And what was the term for this method? And under what class could it be when I want to create a thing that searches for certain kind of JavaScript vulnerabilities? They have ready-made repos for this and all of that, so you don't need to actually write them yourself. But if you want to, it was one of the most fun I had in I spent 20 hours trying to figure it out, and it was fun because it was hard. Like, super hard. It wouldn't have been if I would have remembered the terms, but one doesn't remember the terms. The documentation is actually pretty good, but also bad because it doesn't explain to you these terms, because it expects you to be computer science major. And as said, it requires consulting to get started because it gets very complicated very fast. It is also an additionally paid feature which doesn't really come together to many people. Yeah. Also, I didn't include it here, but guess how many times I have been asked, when can we get the GitHub Copilot to our local instance, or code spaces to our local instance? They don't exist yet, and when they come, well, we need to support them, so probably trying to reverse engineer them at some point. So overall, from my 10 years, I have loved it. Like, it has been one of the easiest upkeeping systems that I have. I'm comparing it to Atlassian's products, and if you have upkept those, it is majorly easier if you know what you're doing. But it's also very hard because it doesn't have a community that does this constantly. I have loved to see how GitHub has been getting better all the time, especially the release of the packages has been a lot faster. Our end users have been more happy with it, and we have been able to improve the service during the years. I didn't include it here, but one time our snapshot for our customer in one of the Finnish data centers took 48 hours to complete. So that meant the system was down 48 hours. Nowadays, we don't use the snapshots anymore because we realize that we don't really need a snapshot that takes 48 hours to take, because that means that we get more bad feedback from users rather than using the backup client and creating systems on top of that to make sure that we have data in safe hands. We've been able to improve all kinds of systems, like how do we upgrade the system. We're able to do more often and constant upgrades. We know what we're testing. We have better documentation by doing more of this. And we have positive stories and learning experiences that I was saying. Yeah. I think I went way too fast once again. So, questions? Sonia is running.
Hello, yes.
There was a question over there.
All right. Yeah, these came as a surprise. I was just
Yeah, sorry, I thought that 16 slides are enough.
So, hi, thank you very much. My name is Johan Enberg, I'm from Molnix. Question, when you say black box, do you mean an appliance or do you mean, let's say, a container or bare metal installation, or how?
I mean appliance mostly. So it's an AMI, like a ready-built virtual machine that you deploy as a ready-built virtual machine. And then you need to go to certain ports, deploy license key, set it up, put the DNS in place by knowing what you need to put the certificates in place, and if you're stupid like we are and put the proxy in front of it, you need to put all of the things that proxying requires in between. And by the way, it uses TCP 22 for SSH, which means none of the cloud load balancers will work out of the box. You need to tune quite a lot because you have TCP traffic and you have HTTPS traffic flowing to the same instance. And if you want to use the same DNS, you have to have the architecture properly built, because otherwise you have all kinds of certification problems which proxies bring. You can do it, but just as a heads up.
Thank you. May I have a second question? Back when you chose GitHub Enterprise, I'm not sure, it was around the time when GitLab became available. Was there any consideration between the two?
It's been 10 years ago. Let's say this way, we didn't choose it. The game developers had chosen it. And then Eficode just became the people who tried to keep it up and running for the customer. We've been doing, so Eficode as itself does a lot of GitLab also. And I do have to say that they're kind of neck and neck in many things, unless you look at the feature comparison tables where, well, just look at the GitLab features and you know what I'm talking about. It's crazy. Other questions? Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much, Kalle.
Thank you. And
applause, please. Thanks.